Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The cold wind sliced through the quiet of the morning as Mark slowly stirred, blinking open his eyes. He was bundled tightly inside his sleeping bag, the canvas of the tent rustling softly around him with each gust. Outside, the sky was beginning to awaken, painted in delicate shades of orange and purple, a silent herald of a new day. For a few moments, he stayed still, listening to the gentle whisper of leaves in the trees and the distant murmur of the stream that wound through the valley below. It was a sound that once carried peace to his heart, a soundtrack to summers filled with laughter and warmth. Now it was merely a backdrop to the heaviness weighing on his chest. With a weary sigh, Mark sat up, stretching his stiff, sore back, each muscle protesting another night spent on the unyielding ground. His unshaven beard itched, and his eyes, still red, betrayed the truth he refused to admit aloud, blaming allergies instead. He knew the real reason they were tired from nights filled with grief, nights spent replaying what he had lost. Outside the tent, he tended to the small fire he had lit the night before, the flames crackling as he set a kettle over them. The aroma of instant coffee soon drifted through the morning air. Its bitter, unpleasant taste was hardly the point. It was the memories it evoked that reached him, a nostalgia that clawed at the edges of his heart. This campsite, this very spot, had once been alive with his family. Summers spent here with his children were vivid in his mind. Ethan learning to pitch the tent, Chloe insisting on sleeping in a hammock, Heather always there, brewing the perfect coffee, teasing him about never getting the water ratio right. Mark had laughed then, genuinely easily. Today, however, the coffee was as bitter as his mood, and the laughter was gone, replaced by silence and memory. Mug in hand, he stepped toward the natural lookout point at the edge of the campsite. The valley stretched before him like a living painting, a vast expanse of green treetops, a river winding like a silver ribbon, mountains standing sentinel around it all. He lingered there, taking it in, letting the beauty of the untouched landscape wash over him. Yet inside, the contrast was jarring. Round him, the world was calm, perfect, unspoiled. Within him, a storm raged, grief, doubt, and memories of Heather all colliding, leaving him raw and exposed. The breeze brushed his face, but it offered no comfort. It felt almost cruel in its indifference, a reminder that life continued even as he remained trapped in the moment when everything fell apart. Among the mountains, in the stillness of nature, Mark searched for the version of himself that had existed before the pain, before the doubt, before Heather. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. It remained turned off, silent, untouched since he had arrived at the campsite 3 days ago. Small, deliberate separation from the world, from the reminders that carried weight he wasn't ready to bear yet. He stared at it for a moment, weighing the thought of turning it on before letting it rest against his chest. A quiet acknowledgement of the life waiting for him beyond the mountains, but not today. He didn't want notifications. He didn't want calls, least off all messages from her. He needed Timonot to think because he'd already made up his mind, but to breathe far away. From the weight of it all, he held the phone for a few seconds, his thumb hovering over the power button, his own reflection. Stared back at him in Thedor's screen, an older man than Harry remembered, tired, worn not just by Agabat, by the effort of years spent.
Otto.
Hold together something that was already cracked. What hurt the most wasn't the betrayal, it was the memory of believing that love would be enough. Fath's efforts were seen, that the dinners, talks, the late-night embrace, FAS held some value for her. With one last sip of coffee, he pressed the button. The screen lit up, messages started rolling in one after another. A digital avalanche that had no patience but to caught his eye right away. Ethan, Chloe. Dad, we just wanted to say we love Vo. We're with you no matter what. Those words took Mark Bazord's prize. He knew he hadn't told his kids yet. He thought they weren't ready. But no, now it was clear that somehow they'd found out. Maybe they overheard something, maybe they saw a text on their mom's phone, or maybe deep down they always knew. Something was wrong. He felt his throat tighten. He ran a hand over high sighs, They knew. And even so, they chose to stand by him in that moment in the middle of nowhere. Mark felt a strange warmth in his chest. It wasn't happy. Was still a long way from that, but it felt like strength, as if Ethan Anklow's words filled a tiny crack in his shattered heart, as if it said, "You're no Taloni." Heather, on the other hand, still didn't know that he knew she was still living in that bubble of silence. Whereas believed she'd buried her actions deep, as if the truth could stay hidden forever. She was probably still printing everything was normal, sending lukewarm messages, trying to keep up appearances. Mark had never replied to any of them, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he had too much hurt, and now standing there, in front of the valley, he knew that her regret and his was about to end. Because the truth only stays buried for so long, and her time was up, he closed his eyes and let the phone drop onto his lap. He took a deep breath. The mountain soundtrack still played on, but now, along with the sound of water and wind, there was a mething, else an internal whisper, the certainty that he had to go back face what he'd been putting off for days. The peace around him was still same, but inside him something new had begun to move. Mark left the mountains in the early afternoon. Theon's clear golden sky was starting to fill with heavy clouds, as if the world felt what he was about to face. The winding road down through the pine trees felt narrower than when he'd driven up a few days before. Now there was no more room to run. With every mile the pain had tried to quiet, and nature started pounding in his chest again. It wasn't just the sadness of a marriage ending. It was the realization that he had loved a woman who, in the end, chose to stab Jim in the back. The neighborhood where they lived looked the same: kids playing on sidewalks, the old man next door watering his garden, neighbors walking their dogs. Everything went on as always, like nothing had happened, and maybe for him nothing had, but for Mark, this first time he was coming back as a different man, not a husband anymore. Bootsomion, who had crossed the point of no return, he parked in front of the house and stayed in the car for a moment. He was breathing deeply, hands tight on the steering wheel, staring at the front of the house he'd walked into so many times with a smile, bringing flowers or Heather's favorite takeout. The porch was still tidy, flower pots in place, the living room curtains swayed in the breezy through the slightly open window. It looked so homey, so stable, and now it felt like a cynical facade. A pretty painting on a wall full of cracks. When I opened the door, he was greeted by the familiar scent of lavender, the room spray Heather loved. She was sitting on this living room couch, legs crossed, with a tablet on her lap and a half-finished shed glass of wine on the side table. She looked up with an automatic Maberhurst smile and said softly, "You came back, Mark." Just watched her. She seemed calm, slightly uneasy, but still holding threne of the situation. That was her gift, faking normal. Till the last second, he only answered with a nod, closed the door, penned him, and walked silently to his Sujawalam chair. He sat down slowly, like he had all the time in the world, but carrieth weight of it on his shoulders. He let his backpack drop to the floor, unzipped the front pocket, and pulled out a brown envelope. Thick, heavy, it was the only thing he brought besides his clothes. Heather followed his movements with her eyes, not quite sure what to expect. When Mark set the envelope on the coffee table, she frowned slightly. "What's that?" she asked, still trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just said, "Open it." She hesitated for a second. He saw something in her eyes, not fear, not yet, more like that subtle sense of suspicion. Like she knew she might be about to lose control of her story. Still, she took the envelope, opened it carefully, and slid contents onto the table. The top pages showed pictures, and instinctively stacked them up quickly, like she could stop her own eyes from seeing. But was too late. Mark watched her insolence. He didn't want explanations. He just wanted to see the exact moment. Her mask fell off. Heather froze. She stared at the photos without a kingdom, as if the paper was on fire. A hotel room, Bradley's face, theatered dress she wore on that night in Chicago. The same night she'd said she was exhausted from the conference and going to bed early. The pictures said more than any excuse ever could. Thessalon's was broken by a nervous forced law. She set the envelope aside and ran her hands through her hair, pulling it back. The way she did when she was under pressure, Mark, this isn't what it looks like, the way she said. That made him narrow his eyes seriously after everything after runnable proof. Shh. She still had the nervato start with a cliche. It was a mistakia moment off wakeness. I felt invisible. You know, we've been drifting apart for so long and suddenly he made Mephiel alive again. Mark didn't reply right away. He let her talk. It was strange torture cling to such weak excuse like they were discussing a bad purchase at the store and not the destruction. Ova 23-year marriage. She tried to stand up bet. He made a small gesture signaling her to stay where she was. It wasn't time for theatrics. You cheated on me with my boss, he said in a low voice, never raising his tone, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You traveled with that choice, you slept with that choice, then you came home, hugged me, ate dinner with me, as if nothing had happened. That's not an impulse, that's calculated. Heather looked like she wanted to speak, but nothing came out forth. First time her face was trembling even, so she tried. I felt so alone, Marque. Shut me out. I needed to feel wanted. I needed to remember I was still a woman. That last line hit him differently. Helen forward, elbows on his knees, and looked straight into her eyes with ascertainty. She'd never seen in him before. You wanted to feel like a woman, and you thought sleeping with another man, waste way to do that it meant more a thone than everything. We built, yeah, I waste here, but I was tired for us, for our future, for our kids. You didn't want talk, you didn't want to fix it, you justito cheat, and now you're blaming it on some emotional void. Heather shrank back in the couch, lost for words, tears were streaming down her face, but Mark stayed completely still. There was no room for pity now. He wasn't there to reconcile or argue about the past. He was there to close the book on this part of his lifetime, seemed to stand still in that living room. Her glass of wine remained done. Top the quiet house now felt like a tomb for everything they once had, and Mark, steady as ever, knew this was just the first step of what was yet to come. Absolutely right, man, and then so much for paying attention to all those details. That's what really makes a story stand out. In fact, in the second part, Mark already showed Heather the photos during the confrontation at home, so in the third part it wouldn't make sense for him to print the photos again just to send them to his old job. Let's fix that inconsistency. Now the correctum line is Mark found out about the affair weeks before he gathered evidence. Short videos from the pen had already printed some of those images to show Heather during their confrontation. And now at the hotel, he's sourcing copies of those same photos or digital versions to file a complaint at Thee's old workplace, where Bradley is his boss. I'm going to rewrite the third part with this logic in mind, keeping the emotional intensity, strong narrative. And the right timing. Mark left the house like someone leaving behind a story he yawns believed would last forever. Theodore clicked shut behind him with a theory. And each step to the car felt like stepping through the debris of a life that no longer existed. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see Heather with her tear-stained face, struggling to find words. Nothing she could say now would change what he felt when he watched those brief but devastating seconds. Off footage, recorded by the pen sheet to Kenichiko. He drove through a light drizzle without any real destination for a few minutes. He made to breathe, but the air felt heavy anywhere that held Momoras. So without telling anyone, he went to a hotel near the airport, a place that reminded him of nothing. And Noonia? Quick check-in, a key card, and a silent hallway. The room was cold, simple, almost impersonal, exactly what he needed. Head dropped. Backpack in the corner, took off his jacket, and sank into therm chair. He stayed there, still staring at the lamp. For a long time, the silence in that room was so complete it felt like it was talking to him, and in that void between pain and exhaustion, Mark finally let his shoulders slump. The tension he'd been carrying for weeks started seeping out little by little. Heather had no idea he discovered a rivalry long before their final confrontation, and when he showed her thought envelope in the living room revealing the photos, it wasn't some spur off the moment thing. It was the end of a road he'd started walking the moment he sensed something was off. The pen with the camera passed AFA's a little gift hadn't recorded much, lens was tiny and the angle limited, but the footage that came back Wasino, a quick kiss, hands touching, and the one sentence from her that would never leave his mind. No one will ever find out the betrayal wasn't just physical. It was planned, carefully hidden. Thought was what hurt the most at the hotel. Ark opened his laptop and plugged in Thar drive, where he'd saved all the files. Looking through them wasn't easy, but it had to be done. He organized the photos into a folder, simply named Bradley, then typed a short, direct, professional email. The recipient, the compliance department at the bank where Bradley still worked as a team leader, where, up until a few days ago, Mark had also worked. Knew this went beyond personal matters. It was a serious ethical breach. Her boss involved with an employee's Wi-Fi'ing work trips as cover for personnel affairs. He attached images, not all of them, just enough to prove the relationship and Raz's significant concerns about professional code. No insults, no angry words, just cold documented truth. In the subject line, he wrote inappropriate relationship. Ween, a supervisor and an employee spouse, attached for review. He hit send, then he closed the laptop. He stared at it like it was a door. He just locked in that moment. The strangest feeling he had wasn't rage, it wasn't peace. Mark didn't feel proud or satisfied, but he did feel certain Hemet had been broken. But he was still a man who valued his word. He'd been loyal, honest, and now he was just letting truth take its course. He laid down on the bed. Without chunging, he looked up at the ceiling. His mind was still spinning from everything thought had happened. Heather's lost expression, the silence in the car, the pain of saying goodbye without a final hug. But in that place behind cold walls with no memories attached. Mark finally took a deep breath for the first time in a long while. Nothing was hidden, no doubts. No lies, no loose ends. The truth was finally all out in the open, and whatever came after, well, he would find out. The world didn't stop after Thustorm, but for Mark, the days passed like they'd lost their color. He went on with his responsibilities anew. Routine and long stretches of silence. What was said couldn't be taken back, and what was done belonged to the past. Now, even though it still hurt like it had happened yesterday, news arrived without warning. Bradley had been for Theda's old boss, the man who used to shake Mark's hand in meetings while sleeping with his wife on business trips, was now out of the bank. The internal investigation concluded that an extramarital relationship with an employee's wife was a serious ethical violation, especially given their positions in the hierarchy. Mark's complaint hadn't been a Nornordiate planted the truth where lies had gotten too comfortable. 2 days later, Bradley called. His name popped up on Mark's phone screen like a punch to the gut. Mark stared at it, let it ring onset-wise 3 times. He didn't answer, note out of fear, not out of resentment, but Beck, 'cause nothing Bradley could say would change what was already done. He turned off the phone and went for a walk around the hotel. Air was still damp from the previous nights. Rain and a light breeze touched his face like a reminder you made it. The following weeks were a silent whirlwind. The divorce went through quickly, just as Mark had planned. No drama, no drawn-out fights. Heather signed the papers without making a scene. Maybesh was ashamed. Maybe she was too Toretto fight. Maybe deep down she knew there was nothing left. The marriage, which began with such genuine vows and shy smiles, at the altar ended in an office with 2 cold signatures. After that, Mark did what he had to do. He visited his kids. It wasn't easy, looking Ethan and Chloe in the eye and knowing what they'd lost in the process. They weren't little kids anymore. But the pain hit them in a way only kids watching their parents split up can understand. They had dinner together, a little, talked about simply things as if the past was suspended for a while. In the end, Mark hugged them tight and said what they needed to hurry. "I'm going to be okay." Then he said goodbye. He went back to the mountains, but this time it wasn't just another escape. It was a farewell. He sold the boat, the one that had been a stage for happy summers and fishing trips with his children. He also sold his fishing gear and all the accessories he'd collected over there now, because he wanted to forget Beck, because he realized it was time to let go of everything tied to a life That didn't exist anymore. A little later, he moved to another state. He bought a modest house near a peaceful lake surrounded by trees and salons. It was a place where he could start over without having to explain his past to anyone. He began working for Lance, taking on clients remotely, and slowly shaped a new routine for himself. Ives and rise, walks, long reading sessions, coffee on the porch, and piece at piece he thought he'd never feel again. 2 months went by, and on a warm spring afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. When he opened it, there they were. Ethan Anklo, smiling, backpacks slung over their shoulders, eyes full of excitement. Cloak it right to the chase, Dad. We want to live with you. Mark stood still for a second, like the world had paused, just to catch its breath. Then, without a word, he opened his arms. They both hugged him at tones, and in that moment, the heart he thought had hardened forever began to thaw with something so rare and pure. It wasn't just love, it was a new beginning. Heather, she was left on her own. Thief air, once it came to light, made a low toff. Their friends drift away from her shetreed to move on, but nothing fit. Toe together like before? Bradley in turn lost his job, and over time his wife found out everything. There were fights, sleepless nights, and salines. But unlike Mark, she forgave him not out of naivety, but because she believed they could start over. Maybe she was afraid of being alone. Maybe it was love. Or maybe she just didn't want to face the weight of the truth. Mark Thel never looked back. He now lived out simple days with his kids in a home free of flies and broken promises, just meals made with care, Chatsby, the lake, and a new story. Being written with blank pages and a heartthought was whole again, and so without fanfare or hurry, life began to smile a theme once more, not with explosions, but with steady, gentle moments, with small things, with presence, with true love, the kind that never betrays. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.